are
Hi.
you?
I'm good.
It's so nice to
I
see you.
know. I was so excited when you reached out to me about this.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. So you're at school?
Yeah. So I'm up in Boston. I'm a behavioral neuroscience major. So it's a lot of the biological reasons for behavior. Like I'm really interested in doing a lot of like neurological and like behavior research with like neurological disorders and other like behavioral disorders. So that's like the end goal. Yeah.
What made you choose this path?
I always knew that I was a very like science oriented person. I come from a very like STEM oriented family and I've always been like a very like volunteering and like working with others. And so I was like, I don't want to just be staring at like a petri dish for the rest of my life. I was like, that's like not the kind of science that I want to do. Neuroscience is definitely kind of bridges that like people aspect and like the science aspect, which I like.
Did you base it more on your interest, like you're explaining right now, or was there also a factor of your personal life or something that you experienced that made you say, like, I want to figure out why people act the way they do?
I have a twin brother who's like physically and like mentally handicapped, and so I've spent like my whole life kind of growing up in the special education and like special needs community and like seeing like that diversity, and so I've always been like very actively involved
Yeah.
in that. I feel like doing neuroscience kind of bridged that very important part of my life into translate it into something like academic and something that I could like make a career out of, which I really liked.
What do you think it is about you that encouraged you to pursue that field or this field? Because for some people, when they've been brought up, exposed to certain challenges or living with certain challenges, they want to choose a life where they no longer have to deal with that. Almost like I've dealt with this in my personal life so much, I don't want to deal with it in my professional life as well. Whereas for you, it seems like that you're taking motivation from that to bring that into your future professional life. What do you think it is? Is it about you that makes you choose that direction?
It brings out this very like empathetic like side of
Mhm.
me, and I think I've had to take on like a caregiver role in the past couple years like, as I've gotten older, and so like I know I didn't want to pursue something like special education that would be more of like a direct
Okay.
connection to that.
Okay.
So, but I think like I'll always have like those people skills that I kind
Mhm.
of had to learn like
Yeah.
growing up in that community.
Mhm.
And so, but I think it's definitely brought out the best in me.
You said it brought out the best in you. So in what way? And then also the challenges that you have faced, because I think they always go hand in hand usually.
Yeah, definitely. Like seeing the struggles that my family has had to go through just definitely motivated me to do something in my future that could help other families. So like one of the biggest things that especially during the pandemic, it was
Mhm.
extremely difficult for my family because a lot of like neurodivergent or special needs kids, like they live for schedule and routine, and when they don't have that, it becomes lots of behavioral backlash and issues can arise from that. And so, like, when my brother couldn't go to school or when he was at home, like, it just, all of that order and balance in his world was just completely, like, ripped out. And, like, he couldn't really understand it.
Mhm.
And that was, like, very, very hard. And especially when last fall, when we went to, like, the hybrid model and when school would get shut down at 10 p.m. at like the night before, and we'd have to like tell him in the morning, like he would take the phone and like call transportation and be like, my bus coming, like getting
Mm.
very, very overwhelmed and upset about it.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge regression in behavior, and because both of my parents will still work, both of them work in the healthcare field, so they were both working full time throughout the entire pandemic. And so finding like childcare options who have people who have
Mm.
experience working with special needs kids and
Mhm.
like trying to find something through the state, there's no like website or there's no real department for it.
Mm.
And so we tried to get services through the state and they take a really long time or they're not great or it was like a Zoom meeting and I was like the last thing Ian wants to do is sit on a
There's
Zoom
another.
meeting. I really saw like the huge need for like reform and like
Mm.
and support and resources. And so I think that's like one of the biggest driving forces. It's like I want to be able to take what I have learned about certain like neurological disorders and diseases, and how can we like make society more accessible for like these individuals. It's starting to get better. You know, we're starting to include neurodiverse people in the conversation where they should have been in the first place.
Yes.
And a lot of research was kind of meant looking for like a cure for autism or like other types of ways to fix people. Now the conversation has switched a lot more to, okay, how can we make society more accessible for a broad range of people? And so I think like that's the spot I want to be in, is help making, you know, whether it's helping individuals like be better integrated into society after high school, after they leave the education system at like 21, and helping them find those community jobs. Or like I know like my brother personally is going to have to live in like a group home at some age, and but you know they're the ones that are sponsored by the state are not always the best, and then but then it's like the ones that are private are expensive. And we are fortunate enough to have like the funds, and my parents have stable jobs to take care of Ian and support him through his life. And I know that eventually like me and my two older brothers will take on that responsibility and take care of him. But you know, there's a lot of people who don't have those funds, or who don't have those resources, or don't even know how to get to those resources. And there's a lot of disparity there. And so just thinking about that like makes me like, I want to do something about it.
To be neurodivergent, or neurotypical, neurodiverse, what do these terms mean?
A neurodivergent person, like generally they have their brain works, it doesn't work according to the standards that we've termed for normal functioning people. And so, and there's been a lot of vocabulary gets thrown around about it, like high functioning, like low functioning. And so there's been a lot of shift with that like over the years. And so some people are more comfortable using those, some people are less comfortable using those terms. A lot of it depends on like the neurodiverse person who you're talking to and asking them like how they feel like comfortable and what they want to use. But yeah, those are like the two main terms. So in my family, we usually just say like mentally handicapped or neurodivergent. I'm a part of this club here, and it's called Strong Women, Strong Girls, and it's an organization in Boston, and they have a bunch of chapters at these colleges, and you do mentoring in like the public school system outside of Boston. And so you go into these 3rd through 5th grade classrooms, and you go, it's like an after school program, and we mentor these girls for like an hour and a half. It's literally like, it's like the highlight of my week.
Good.
But part of the club, what we do for like kind of like a professional development for the mentors is once a week we have these best practices sessions, or what they're called. So we've discussed like neurodiversity, critical race theory, body image and self-confidence, all these big hard-hitting topics. But you know, so we will all read through the resources provided, and then we have like a 30-40 minute discussion in these small like 4 to 5 groups. And so when we talked about like neurodiversity as one of our topics, we were all kind of saying like it's weird to think about who was the first neurodiverse person you met, and like how none of us really have ever received a formal education on neurodiversity really until some of us got to college and took a psychology class, or we took a psychology class in high school. Like there was no real like emphasis on it anywhere. And so I think we are saying even like learning about neurodiversity in school not only like promotes that sense of belonging, but also it kind of adds like some transparency, that because I think we're taught that neurodiversity is obviously a broad spectrum, but we only ever really see or hear about the two very big ends. Like we see the kids who are like isolated in the special education department, we see those kids who are separated, or you know, we see these big articles in the New York Times about this autistic person who has this crazy big IQ and like got into MIT, or we always see like the extremes, big wonderful extremes. And so a lot of people with like ADHD or dyslexia who maybe fall into that spectrum in middle or other ends of it, people don't recognize like that they could qualify for an IEP, or they don't know where the process starts, or how they think, oh, I'm doing well enough that I don't need it. Like a lot of IEPs can just help people with more well-being things.
I personally think everybody should have an IEP. I think everybody has something that they can support with, or just more of something. Yeah.
Senior year in high school, I say that like that wasn't like 6 months ago, but I was an old and mature college student.
You're way past high school.
Way past high school. But my research topic that I did my senior year, which was like an independent study, was on special education retention rates in New Jersey, and how they're up to like 25%, and how there's this huge, so like that's like the turnover rate, people who are going into special education and leaving, and how there's this extremely high turnover. And those rates tend to vary between like 11% and 14%, but it's about 25% for special education. And New Jersey itself has been in a deficit since I think 2002. They have these identifiable factors that contribute to burnout, and so whether that's like work overload, or it's like behaviors of students, and special education tends to align with those identifiable factors the most, and so that's like reasons for why the rates are so high. So another big factor is a lot of skills that you need for special education, or education in general, you can't teach in a classroom setting. People who just can empathize with their students and have patience and understanding. They call it the revolving door effect, is actually, and where you have these teachers are leaving, and we're sending in teachers who aren't trained well enough, essentially, to go into these positions just for them to leave, and then there's a shortage again, and then it just contributes to this cycle. So it's like, we need teachers now, so shorter alternative training programs, but then it's like, are you prepared enough, and are you going to stay in the profession for a long time?
What do you think about the fact that it's even called special education? For me, it's just education.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
When we do see that separation of kids going into other classrooms and having that name for that, you do start to notice the differences and categorizing people. And so a lot of schools have talked about implementing like open classroom, or where teachers are providing a variety of teaching styles to meet all the needs of people. And, a lot of that I think is a very great idea, but we can only expect so much of teachers. A lot of times when we try and implement neurodiverse strategies, I think it does end up helping a lot of the neurotypical kids more.
For sure.
Because it's kind of finding that balance where neurodiverse students a lot of times do need that like attention, specialized help or needs, and for some special needs and lower functioning individuals, they do need to be in that separate area and having those needs met. And so it's like a fine line of wanting to give people the need that they want, that they like the meeting their needs, but then also the othering of people. And I think especially, and that's why I think that teaching about neurodivergence at a young age is really important. And there's this one article, it's from Baylor University, published it. And they were talking about how you can teach, and they broke it up into age groups. It was ages like 5 to 9, 10 to 11, and 12 to 17, on how we can start the conversation at an age appropriate, and talking about the conversation, because I think we don't give kids enough credit for how smart they are, and and I think the approach of just like ignoring the differences has been a thing. And like, oh, we're all the same. Like, it's very foo-foo, and like kids are like, screw this. Like, obviously kids notice differences, and then by ignoring those differences, that's how you get those implicit biases and those biases.
I think that kids, although they can be rough around the edges, the way kids will point certain things out, they could be a little blunt, but but I appreciate that in a way, because it's like unfiltered truth. And then you can work with that.
Yeah.
And you can say, okay, well, maybe we don't say it that way, or maybe we don't do it this way, but here's like the reality or the truth behind this difference. Even the word difference has such a negative connotation sometimes that there's no need for that. So I do understand your point as far as, but there's always an opportunity for more inclusion. So though they may need to be in their own space for having their needs met, which I think is necessary. And I also think it's like there's also legalities involved. I think there's certain laws involved, things like that. That I think is okay, because even there's other types of students that have also need their own space, even within a neurotypical classroom. So I think that's okay, but I do think there's more opportunity than we're taking advantage of right now to give them more opportunity, give ourselves more opportunity. Everyone gains from this, I think. I think everybody done in the right way with the right intentions.
If we want our students to understand these topics, then we need to make sure that we're educated about them ourselves. And I love that you mentioned like the legal, because one of my favorite lines from like the article was that inclusion is mandated by law, but meaningful education about disabilities goes beyond legal compliance, which I think is very, very important. And kids have these curiosity about things they want to understand and they want to nurture. And if you address those conflicted feelings and normalize the confusion at that young age, I think especially before it gets to, 6th grade, middle school, when everyone becomes very overly aware of how they're perceived. And that's when the social cliques are formed. And you want to fit in, you don't want to be different. Like, you want to fit in with everyone. And it's the only thing you think about, or at least that's the case when I was in middle school. By promoting that sense of community and focusing on the empathy and kindness and creating that, it helps shield a lot of kids from that bullying aspect. And one of the ways I think we could start implementing that is they talk about, I think, representation is an extremely important thing to talk about. So whether that's, reading more books and novels that have neurodiverse main characters, or and getting them to start thinking about that, or whether it's showing them TED Talks or other motivational speakers who are neurodiverse, who come from neurodiverse backgrounds. I think letting those voices be heard and amplifying those and letting kids be exposed to all of those things. You
mentioned representation. So I'd like to know, as Ian's representative, what it is that you envision for him, or what you would have liked to have seen for him, or the things that went really well for him or were successful for him. Because I know that for a lot of people watching this, they may not realize the various factors that kind of come into play in a public school, or not even just public school, but just school setting. What are the realities behind the scenes, or things that you can kind of give light to? Because, and I'm sure it's not just the straight path.
There's been a lot of growth, whether it's been up and down and linear and exponential, and seeing how Ian's progressed in certain things. And there's a year ago, we never thought he would be able to shower himself, and now he can do it by himself, and he goes to bed by himself. And there's a lot of those moments that I think parents don't always realize. I think one of the biggest things that I wish the school had was definitely more of a year-round school system, because I know they do have some ESY, extended school year in the summer, but kind of making it a more year-round transition, I think, would be in keeping that routine. At least one of the good things has been that the JCC, in Bridgewater, has a very a respite program a lot for special needs kids, and that's actually been very, very helpful. And they have and they even opened up a branch of their summer camp that was specifically for the special needs kids, and I think that's been great, having that as a resource. And so after school, we were able to work with the busing, so he'll get bused from the high school to the JCC where he meets with someone. And just, I think it's hard for a lot of parents, because the school day ends at 2:15, 2:30, but then you're not getting home from work 6:30, and you got to figure out dinner. And so I think if there was some kind of aftercare program that could just even extend it to 4 or 5 o'clock, and just really, and it's nice that we were able to find something that in the community, but there's a lot of moving pieces. The special needs community is a very, very understanding and accepting and lovely support system, which I think is great. You find Facebook groups, you find all these different outlets, because there is really a lot of red tape, and there's a lot of lines, and there's waiting, and there's not getting support that you need. So when you can hear from parents, people are very open to sharing resources, which I think is a great thing. And they can help you, like, okay, like this program worked really well for us, like, or this place has done a really good job taking care of and hiring like neurodiverse staff and or special needs staff. And so there's a lot of connections with that, I think. And so exploring those options, and it really just depends where your child is at, like that stage. When the two of us turned 18, my parents had to assume legal guardianship of him, and going through that process, and like me and my brothers were a part of that. And so my two older brothers are also twins, and they're 5 years older than me. Me and my siblings are a lot closer now, and part of that's probably due to trauma bonding. But you know, I think there's always been this like innate understanding between the three of us where we know that no fight or dispute or argument will ever be big enough to break the three of us apart, because we know that all three of us are going to work together to like take care of Ian, and he'll always be like our number one priority. Like I couldn't ask for it any other way. Like I don't think I would be like such a caring like person as I am like now because of him. And I think that, you know, while it's definitely like shredded my family to thin at some points, you know, it's really like I am really, really close with my older brothers because of it. And like we know that we're always going to be there for each other to like take care of him. And I think I did have like a lot of guilt, like going to college.
As the twin that is not neurodivergent, how have you carried that? And I can imagine that on a human level, that there isn't a level, as you've said, guilt or responsibility to lead your life a certain way.
Oh, 100%. And I think, you know, it's always like that when you tell people you have a twin, they're like, oh, where does he go? And then you're kind of like, well, like, actually, like, he doesn't, like, he lives at home and he's, like, handicapped. And so it's always and then people, like, they feel kind of bad. And I'm like, no, it's not a bad thing. But I usually just don't want to explain. Like, it's just, like, it's a long thing to explain. Like, it's not that I feel embarrassed or, like, upset or like shameful about it, but if he can be like just Ian, then you know I can be just Ella. Like it has given me this perspective. It's like people aren't meant to fit in boxes. Like the people who are putting people in boxes is to make other people feel better and compartmentalize. And that's something that I have unlearned a lot because of him and having that as an example in my life.
There's no rules. Yeah. You've made them all up.
Exactly. Yeah. I did have this kind of guilt, like leaving my family and, you know, leaving them without that extra part in the support system. And I think that was really, really hard for me. And, you know, it's like I'm not super far away, but, you know, it's still a good, like, distance.
4 hours, yeah.
It's like a 4 hour, 5 hour. But he calls me a lot and he FaceTimes me. It's very, very sweet. He came up for Parents Weekend and it was so fun. And, you know, but, you know, my Parents Weekend looked different than other people's Parents Weekend, you know? If Ian was getting too overstimulated, no, we had to go sit down for a while and do something else with him and, you know, run on his time a little bit. And, you know, like, it's okay. Yeah. You know, we brought my grandma up with us too and she stayed with him for some time. And, you know, we bring the support system with us and, you know, making the most of it. And it was such a fun time. It was a little stressful, but it was really great to see them. Oh, he listens to Queen in the shower. My dad puts it on. And when the song, like, You're My Best Friend, he goes, Ella, my best friend. It's so sweet. Or he'll be on the phone. I hear my dad in the background. He's like, who are you talking to? He goes, my sister. Or he's like, Ella, come home soon. Like, you know, he'll take my mom's phone and he'll call me and he'll be like, what you doing? And it's very cute. And you know,
that says a lot about you and a lot about your relationship. What about in terms of, you talked about services and you talked about the state and the reform overall. What kind of reforms do you think need to take place?
Yeah. Well, I'll send you, this is another project that I found that I'll send you. It's from the University of Edinburgh. They just like launched this new project back in like March of 2020 called Leans, and it's learning about neurodiversity at schools. And it talks about how when teachers want to talk about, you know, biology or other topics, you know, there's this whole set of resources. You can go online and find worksheets, and you can find printable PDFs or other things, and how it talks about there's no real like resource for that to learn about neurodiversity in schools. There's no primary learning module. One of the things that they recommend is helping people, you know, schools do assemblies and bringing in people who are neurodiverse and having them give assemblies to students. So they're working on providing resources for teachers to teach age-appropriate topics to students about neurodiversity. You know, if you start when they're 5 to 9, and then you grow up, and then you keep adding to the conversation and building it up. And I think the biggest thing that I've taken away is that it should be something that you're always learning about, and that you're continuing to go through, and that it's always there's always more to learn. Yeah. And I think especially in like the neurodiverse community, a lot of that comes from the difference between amplifying voices and speaking over voices. And I think, you know, a lot of people, we don't give enough credit to a lot of neurodiverse people. They are capable to be speaking for themselves, you know, like Ian as not, like he needs someone to be there to represent him and help him. And, you know, that's what, you know, my family knows him best, and like know his needs best. Yeah. And so that's when I feel comfortable speaking about him.
It's our own discomfort too, because even though we're in the role of educator, we're in the role of, you know, the adult, I do wonder, and I do question, like how many people are willing to overcome their own discomfort because they have not been raised with this exposure, have not been raised with this education, have not been made aware of, you know, the biology perhaps behind what's happening. Maybe in the last like 10 years or so, it's definitely been more and more like Autism Awareness Month. And, you know, but I feel about that same way I feel about like Black History Month. It shouldn't be a month. It should be all the time. And it's just part of our history. It's part of our population. So, I mean, it's good at least we have that as a starting point, sure. But like now I feel like, all right, at this point we need to integrate it. Let's step it up now at this point. And I do wonder, like, is there a reservation on the part of the adults in the room? You asked us earlier about the first time you come across somebody who's neurodivergent. I feel like it's usually in a case where, unless you are related to or someone who is, I feel like usually it's in a situation where it's maybe unexpected. It's usually in a situation where you're like, I don't know what to do. Or like maybe you like almost go into like a freeze mode. I feel like people don't want to say anything wrong, or they don't want to be offensive. They don't want to hurt the person. They also are maybe confused. So I just feel like what you're saying is so important, because if we just made it a well-known, common, just matter of fact, this is another part of, you know, reality in the world, that maybe those situations would be minimized, and therefore we wouldn't build on that fear over time, or discomfort. I don't know if it's fear, but like discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think learning to just humanize others and addressing those conflicted feelings, because it's a lot of people who haven't been exposed to that, or who grew up in a time where it was very, very like othered and, you know, not talked about. And I think especially now that there's so many, like we talked about, like we've seen a lot of the extreme ends of the spectrum, but especially now that there's so much more awareness for like ADHD or dyslexia, or a lot of those other differences, or like ADD, like getting people to, like, even if it is adults, getting them to meet and to kind of learn, and, you know, providing books written by, or different, you know, different books or resources about different neurodiverse people. And I think really kind of unlearning a lot of those biases that we've just kind of, you know, bottled up because, you know, we haven't explored those curiosities or talked about it. And, you know, I think also too, it's a lot easier to understand physical disability. You know, it's easier to point out and understand it versus what they call like invisible, like a lot of more mental,
emotional
handicaps, you know, emotional, you know, those are harder for people to conceptualize and understand. I think that also needs to be a forefront of a lot of movement about that, because while they can have like generalized diagnoses, one kid with autism and another kid with autism are not the same person. Like everyone has their own individualized needs, and what works for one student isn't going to work for another student. And while there is some room for generalizations about certain topics that have worked, like neurodiversity isn't one size fits all. And I think that's just individuals in life, everything.
What reform do you think we need in that arena? Like, what do you think exists that you feel like is okay? Like, okay, it's working, or what do you think is not present and needs to be legally?
I think one of the biggest issues is that when schools do have budget issues, usually special education is one of the first things on the chopping block, which I think, and lack of resources with that. So I think that's something that we need to be exploring better, is how well are we funding these programs, and how much strain are we putting on these teachers? Because a lot of teachers address that when you have a variety of needs in a classroom, it's hard to tailor your education to one of them, and it's harder. How can we be providing more aids, and how can we be getting more people in those classrooms? And I think some type of ratio, like legalized ratio, I think could be important, because I think if you have, it's hard enough for a teacher in a neurotypical classroom to talk and teach to 25 different students. Everyone has different learning styles, and I think those are only heightened in special education, and we can't expect one teacher to be able to get all of that information across to their students. And I think, a lot of it comes from just reform with education in general. While we can talk about how, we want to implement lessons on neurodiversity, we want to do all these things and teach kids about them, but at the end of the day, teachers only have so much time in the classroom with their kids, and there's all these state mandated testing requirements that you need to get to. And
I think that part of the education for students as well as staff should also be for the caretakers. I don't think it's enough just bring awareness to the neurodivergent child or adult, but I also think for the families, because I have to imagine literally shapes I'm sure so much of who you are, who you're not, things that you want, things that you don't want, fears that you have. Was there any part of this that created any level of resentment for you? I feel like that would be a very human reaction to have as well.
If my mom tells me this story, when I was in second or third grade, she reached out to the one guidance counselor they had in the primary school, and was like, is there a support system, or is there a group for kids who have neurodiverse siblings? And they were like, no. That doesn't exist. And I think I've been very fortunate to kind of have worked my way into that, and I have found those amazing support systems. But I feel like I can't talk about my family to someone who doesn't experience that, because it's because they don't understand. And it's not their fault, but it's hard, or people will feel bad for me and they'll pity me, and I'm like, no, it's not a burden, but it's a responsibility. And I think providing networks for those kids, and I think especially when you're at a young age, and for me it was a twin, and I think it's hard, especially I've seen it's hard for younger siblings who have older siblings, and it's I'm younger than you, but I'm more mature, more functioning. I think being able to set up spaces for even I still feel them, those internalized just sometimes, and you think about if I had just been a normal twin, what would have happened, or and you do have that guilt, you're not wishing it was different, but you do have a lot of those internalized feelings where I wish I could just talk to this about someone. And I know that was especially hard for me during the pandemic, when Ian was having a lot of these behavioral outbursts and a lot of these things, and it was I wish I could just talk to someone about this and and have them understand, because I was I don't want the only people who really understand are my siblings, and we don't want to talk about it because we're experiencing it, and we don't want to talk about it any more than we have to, and So I think that's like another thing that I think I would have benefited from, like having, and I do have like Ian's like friends have like siblings, and I've talked to them about like what it's like growing up with different siblings. And I think a lot of it is you come into it and like you meet these people, but there was never, like back in like second grade, like there was never like that support system. And I think that a lot of it I kind of had to learn myself, and it helped having older siblings who were more mature than I was and could help me kind of, talk about things and
navigate the process. I mean, it's a lifelong process, but now that you are at the stage that you're at, how do you teach someone not to be resentful of their situation? Because I think that's a skill in general that we can learn, we can teach kids. So how do you teach kids not to be resentful, and how do you teach kids to advocate for themselves? Because I think, unfortunately, the way the system is set up, it requires a lot of advocating for ourselves.
emphasizing that families can be different and that everyone's family isn't just this little nuclear family unit. Like, and that comes back to representation, that families can be different. People can have like 2 dads, 2 moms, 1 mom, no dad, or grandparents who take care of them, or, they can be adopted, look different. Like siblings can look different physically, siblings can be different mentally. And I think that emphasizing that just because a family doesn't fit into that little bubble doesn't mean that, they're at like a disadvantage and they want to try and change things to fit into that box. And I think when it comes back to the advocacy, a lot of it is, you won't get the resources unless you're the one at the forefront. And when we add that layer of transparency and we tell them, like, these are the resources we have available. These are different things that we can have in place, whether it's extra time on certain projects or it's extra time on certain topics, and like being understanding about it. And, then we can help kids advocate for themselves, or really parents, because, if you're 8 or 9, like you're not going to understand what an IEP is and like talk about it and be like, I need this. It's different, like versus in college, there's like the DRC, the Disability Resource Center. And even now people don't always feel comfortable going there and being like, I need these services. And, a lot of kids get lost in the shuffle. Like I even remember the end of senior year, I got a concussion. Yeah, I was playing softball. I got hit in the head.
Oh, no.
And then I was talking about this with like Dr. Masato, and she was like, has like your guidance counselor like reached out to you about anything? I was like, no. She was like, there's supposed to be like a whole protocol that goes in place for kids who get concussions about extensions on assignments and getting time. Like there's like a legalized thing for it. But I remember her saying to me, she was like, Ella, like you are a self-advocating, responsible student who is going to like you'll be fine if you didn't like take advantage of those resources. She's like, if there's a kid who's a quiet like freshman who has a concussion, is just in the back of the classroom and like isn't able to vocalize those things, they aren't gonna get like that list of needs. And I think that was kind of like eye-opening. There's so much that just needs to be like torn down and built back up. And I think what's so important, nothing is like an isolated issue. It's mental health. It's, it's like young, like Black girls are less likely to get like mental health resources that they need. And that draws back. And then also with special education, like areas that are low income, don't have the funds for school, and then they can't have the resources for everything. And like, there's so much like
layered
that goes on. It's like, when you talk about one, it's like you kind of talk about everything. And, it's
I
like,
always think that it comes back to self-reflection on our part as individuals. And I feel like sometimes we want a quick fix or a quick, and all these things take such time. But it starts with, I think, internal reflection. What am I aware of? What do I not know? What do I need to learn? How do I learn it? Who do I talk to? What do I need to unlearn? And I just feel like it's so great that you are such an advocate and you're studying this. Now, I had asked before too about how do you prevent resentment? Like the fact that, you are blessed with the burden of the situation that you're in, as we all may feel about our own circumstances? How do you not feel resentful? Like, well, why don't I get to just be a normal, neurotypical college kid without any of these other concerns or considerations?
Mm-hmm. You know, it goes back to like the human reflection. Like we hate like doing that and like thinking about it. And I think, you know, a lot of it has been when I get those feelings of resentment, instead of like burying it down and like feeling upset about it, like why am I feeling, like instead of being like, why am I feeling like that, like that's awful for me to think that, instead I think back to like, why am I feeling like that, like why am I being like upset or like resentful in this moment. And you know, like I went home for like one night like a couple weeks ago, and my parents were like, oh, like can you babysit Ian tonight? And I was like, I'm coming home for one night and you're gonna put me on babysitting duty. And I did have a bit of that, like, yes, I'm like excited to come home and like see you guys, but like, you know, you're just throwing me back into this responsibility that I haven't really had to have for like 2 months. And instead of just like burying that and like
You just say
think
it.
like, you know, allowing myself to feel through my own emotions, I think is like a big important thing. I think for everyone can benefit from that. And, you know, rather than just dismissing them as like bad or good, like resentful is like a normal thing. We can't expect to hold ourselves to this pedestal. And I think that's a common struggle among a lot of siblings of neurodiverse and, you know, special needs, like siblings. Like we can't expect to we're human. Like we can't expect to hold ourselves to this higher standard of care and love and understanding just because we're brought up in this different situation. And I think I can still be a caring and loving sister and then also have my own emotions and my own thoughts and, you know, being my own person in that way. Opening conversations with kids in a way where if they feel comfortable sharing, like talking about like their own neurodiverse like backgrounds, whether it's a student who is neurodiverse themselves or has a family member, and you know, they can creating that openness and that exposure and just talking about things. And if kids are comfortable, like learning about something and reading about something in an article does not translate as well when someone else is talking about it from their own personal experience. So that's why, you know, bringing in guest speakers, watching TED Talks, like you hear someone talk about it, like, oh, that's a real thing. But
you're a real person and attached to this story,
yeah.
and therefore it adds a layer to it. Now, you mentioned the word responsibility. How do you feel like, I imagine, and I'm assuming a lot here, correct me if I'm wrong, that growing up with a neurodivergent twin brother probably added a lot of responsibility to your plate that perhaps if you were not in that particular in those particular circumstances, perhaps you would not have those specific types of responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like as you're getting older, that makes you more averse to responsibility? Like, oh, I don't want any more responsibility on my plate than I need? Or does it make you invite it more like, no, because of this, I'm prepared, and now I want to be even more responsible?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's pushed me in like the latter direction. Like, you know, I'm the one at like the forefront of the group project, or I'm like the one who's, you know, reaching for like higher positions. And I think I'm like, I've gotten better at like advocating for myself and, you know, just reaching out to, like, you know, like here, like these PhD students came into my psychology class and I really liked the research they were doing. So just sending them an email like, hey, like, can I get involved in your lab next semester? And I think the best things don't go to people who always work the hardest or are the smartest. It's the people who are willing to put themselves out there and finding those connections that fall into place. Yep. So much of it is like that
networking.
And networking is such a buzzword, but so much of it is just like those personal connections that you make with people. So I think I have been at like, because of like my experience like growing up with Ian, like that has kind of put me at like the forefront of that. But I've also seen it work in the opposite way with some people. Like they're like, there's a lot of burnout and like emotional burnout that you deal with. And, you know, I'm like, oh, like people always tell me, oh, you're so mature for your age, or like you matured so fast. And I was like, part of me didn't get to have like that childhood innocence thing. You know, it's like we applaud kids who are mature at their age and like mature really well. I'm like, why can't like we can appreciate kids who are just kids? Like, you know.
How did you avoid emotional burnout?
that's something I'm still kind of dealing with.
Okay.
I think we're dealing with a lot of like behavioral aggressive like outbursts from Ian over the pandemic, and so much was just going on in his world. And I remember like I had to really like shut down emotionally. And as like a coping mechanism, I had to kind of separate like angry, very upset Ian and like Ian, like my brother. And I remember just like thinking to myself, and like I was so just like emotionally repressed and like removed from the situation. I was like, am I ever gonna feel like emotions again? It is so much to carry. And like I think advocating for mental health, like like I've seen a therapist for like 3 years, and I think that gives me an outlet to talk about a lot of the things with Ian, and like understanding like some people will never understand, but like they can still like support you about certain things. You need an emotional outlet where you can just give like your unfiltered like emotions to, because so much of that, when there's so much filtering when you have like like even like my parents, like we always watch our language, and Ian listens to everything. Like he will pick up on something, he will tell you, like we'll say something in one room and then he'll like chime in from another room and start laughing. Elephant's memory does not, he remembers everything. Like you could ask him who his ski instructor was, and like when he was like 6, and he'll tell you it was Marcus. Because there was a couple of times like this past like school year, like when I was in high school, where Ian would have like a big outburst, and I was like, I just like can't go to school today. Like I need to take like the day off for myself to get back mentally. And then you're like sending an email to your teacher and you're like, I'm having a family emergency. And it's like you're like, how do you bring that across without having too many questions, getting into the nitty-gritty? And I think there's a lot of balancing with all of that, and it's definitely something that it takes a lot of like one step forward, 2 step back. And
when you turn 18, like does he get a high school diploma?
They're allowed to walk at graduation when they're 18 or a senior. My mom was like, yeah, like when are the two of you gonna get to graduate together? Like so I think like, this felt like a real like twin moment. And they allowed his aide to come with us, and she sat in the chair next to him. We were at the end of the row, and then but the aide like couldn't walk the graduation, so like we go to the end of the row. I'm with Ian, and like he's behind me, and I think it was Dr. Godown, one of the administrators at the high school, actually stepped in, and like they're all in like the graduation attire, and he like stepped in line behind Ian and I, and like made sure that like he stood with Ian, and because I went first because of like alphabetically, and I got my diploma, and he gets like a certificate, but it's like in the diploma holder.
Nice.
But it was really sweet that he just kind of noticed that and stepped in to make sure Ian went at the right time. They like said his name, and then they take your photo like right in front of these balloons, and we got the photographer to take a photo of the two of us. And
nice.
It was a really, really sweet, like special moment. And he had his hat on his head, and he kept like leaning over forward in his chair until it would fall off, and then he would start laughing, and then he'd put it back on. And like at one point his aide just like held it. It was like, Ian, no. But when we all threw our hats up in the air, he thought it was hysterical. He loved it. Of course, like on the way there, like he didn't want to wear like the button down shirt. He wanted to wear this like t-shirt. So then he's wearing like a t-shirt, a button down, and his graduation cap, and he's like sweating profusely. But we're like, you know what? It's whatever. Like it was just like a really special moment that we were able to have, and it was like a normal twin thing, I guess. But
the milestone you got to share together that you're supposed to be able to share together.
I think I appreciate it the most because I was older and I was more mature versus if I was like in elementary school, and it's hard to vocalize that to other people.
So just those considerations that we probably don't even think about. So what are some things like or places maybe that you've been where where you found a lack of accommodations, I'll say?
I think a big thing, has always been like restaurants, or we're like, like we need to like, or like, like we can't sit you unless your whole party is here. It's like he's very antsy and agitated. It's like, can we please just get a table and like have him be able to sit? And we're, so certain things like that have always like been upsetting. And a lot of it doesn't always come directly from staff. It can be just from other people's looks. And it's a lot of things that are like almost there, like they were good, and then it's like there's the caveat to it. But
Yes.
I will say there was one of the best accommodations that we've seen is there's this one company, I forget the name of them, but they work with Broadway shows and they do what they call autism friendly shows. And
Oh,
so we've seen The Lion King and Frozen with him because Ian loves musical theater. Like he loves music, he loves like songs and everything. Like
same
it's a
here.
very like calming thing for him and he loves music. You know, I drive around with him all the time in the car and we'll listen to like Queen or like Raffi or like the Hamilton soundtrack. Like there's a whole playlist. It's
Yeah.
very disorganized, but you know, he loves music. And so what they do is they make the effects like less loud, not as like they don't turn the lights off all the way. And then they also have and so it's like at like the regular Broadway theaters with like the regular actors and everything. And
Mhm.
there's a variety of needs there. They have lots of like wheelchair spots and everything, and then they give out like free shirts and like free little
Nice.
toys to kids, and they actually have like separate sections which like we've used sometimes, and they have separate sections like waiting areas where they have like toys where kids can use, or they have like different like calming activities where if you don't want to sit like in the actual theater, and they have like TVs where they're showing the show and you can still watch and enjoy the show but maybe in a quieter space. And I think the best thing about that too was even just if some kid starts yelling or crying, no one's looking around being like, "Oh, be quiet." Like, you know,
Yeah.
it was like everyone there is aware that this
Yeah.
is what the
This is,
show is. And so that was something that was really, really special and like warmed my
we could
heart.
learn from that in so many ways. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Or even there's this one place, it's called Camp Fatima in New Jersey, and they do, you know, it's like we wish we could have more of these things, but it's like a long application process, and like it's like I think it's like 15-page application, and like and they sometimes do interviews, and it's pretty selective, but it's a week-long sleepaway camp for special needs kids, and it's all volunteer based. It's all people had to go
Is
through
that
special
safe?
training,
Okay.
and it's free. Like it's
Oh,
free of
wow.
cost for so you have to apply for it, and that's why it's
Yeah.
very selective. But
Yeah.
you know, and they take like a broad range of kids. But
So if you had to, let's say, narrow it down to three things that the school systems can do to address neurodiverse or neurotypical even, what would you say those three things should be?
I would say as a starting point, definitely increasing representation is like the first place we can start. And that could be something as even supplementary readings. Representation is something that can be very adaptable to different age groups. You
Yeah.
know, they have like picture books where it's like the main character has autism, or you know, or then they also have chapter books, or it's something that's very manageable for multiple age ranges. So I think that's what makes it very a lot easier to implement. And you know, it's TED Talks, it's you know, guest speakers, assemblies. I think that's something that can easier be implemented. I would say the next step for that would be definitely professional development and staff development, kind of going hand in hand with that. You know, if we're expecting teachers to educate students on neurodiversity, making sure that they have a certain background and that they have an understanding and unlearning those implicit biases. And I think that's an important spot. And then I think ultimately the end goal is having a change in legislation and curriculum to include these certain learning about different movements. And I think this is important to learn about at all for so many topics. Implementing that legally into a school system's like required educational services. You know, I think that that is kind of like the end goal.
You know, it's also when you want to, you find room, you make
Yeah.
room. And I think that it's even if it's just subconscious by us talking about it and puts it in someone's subconscious to consider, like, if I'm choosing between this book and this book, I can promise you that now I'm thinking about, well, who's the main character in that book? There are so many opportunities, even if it's just one more time than you normally would have done it.
Something, it gets the ball rolling. You know, it starts with implementing certain things like concrete, and then a lot of it comes organically. And I think whether it's you know, a presentation that families can come to, whether it's like on a night where it's like, come learn about the resources that we have for your student, and it's can be outside the classroom, or it can be something that can be met, and it can be a Zoom meeting that can be sent out, or it can be a recording that people get sent out, so it's like even if you can't make it in person, you can still see it. Something that really lays it out, not just in like the legal terminology, but something that's understandable to parents, and I think that they can take advantage of. And I think, you know, really encouraging that among, that we're not only helping the students like in the classroom, but really just helping them meet their needs wherever it's needed, and whether it's helping them find tutors outside of school or connecting them. So having, those resources available for parents, and whether it's extending the school day for special needs kids in certain areas, and giving that additional support outside the classroom, and like making it an integrated support system. And
totally get it. Thank you, Ella, so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Of course, this was amazing.
Welcome for me too. I really appreciate all of your thoughts, and I'm always here if you need anything.
Yes.
And keep in touch with me, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. This was so great.
It was
Have
so
an
good.
awesome day. Bye.
Yes. Bye.